Not say. Yeah.
Hey, good afternoon. I'm Scott Sagan, the co-director here at the Center for National Security and Cooperation and professor of political science. It's my pleasure today to be chairing this session with Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, speaking on cascading crises and competing visions for the future. H.R. is the Fuad and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, the Bernard and Susan Littaude Fellow here at the Freeman Spogli Institute, and a lecturer in Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. He served for 34 years with distinction in the U.S. Army. In 1991, he served with distinction in the 2nd Cavalry, in the Gulf War, and then in the Iraq War, he was the commander of the 3rd Cavalry Regiment. In addition to being a distinguished soldier, he served as the 25th Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, starting in June 2017 to 18.
February of 17 to like April of 18.
2018. He holds a PhD in history from the University of North Carolina and is the author of Dereliction of Duty, Johnson, McNamara, the Joint Chiefs, and the Lies That Led to the Vietnam War. He is more recently author of Battleground, The Fight to Defend the Free World. And he has forthcoming in August a new book called At War with Ourselves, My Tour of Duty in the Trump White House. We're very much looking forward to hearing that and to hearing him speak today. We'll be talking for about 40 minutes. And then I'll be trying to catch people's attention. Raise your hand, and I'll try to keep a queue, but I'll also be asking everyone who's online if you could put your question in the Q&A, and I'll try to bring up questions from the online audience as well. So please join me in welcoming H.R. McMaster.
Thanks, Scott. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Hey, it's a real privilege to be with everybody. Thanks for the opportunity and especially to talk with you at such a critical moment, I think, a momentous moment, if I can say that, that I think is important to the future of security and prosperity in our world. And I entitled this Cascading Crises because I do believe that we are at risk of crises cascading further from the ones that we're witnessing today in Europe and across the Middle East and into the Indo-Pacific. And I think that what we do now will determine, I think, whether or not we remain on the cusp of, I think, a world war. And I think that sounds maybe alarmist to a lot of you, but I'd like to talk with you more about that maybe during the Q&A, and then explore some of these connections between ongoing crises and why I believe that we're at a particular dangerous time. So we're witnessing cascading crises from the war in Ukraine to the wars in Gaza and across the Middle East. And as we can contemplate looming crises from the South China Sea to the Taiwan Strait to the Senkakus and Ryukyus Islands to the Korean Peninsula, I think most Americans tend to view these conflicts as, and people across the world and potential conflicts discreetly, and therefore, miss connections between them. And that's a problem because I think a failure to recognize how an axis of aggressors, whose members include authoritarian hostile regimes in Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, and Pyongyang, leads to missed opportunities to counter their aggression, missed opportunities to resolve ongoing conflicts and prevent violence from spreading to other theaters. Moreover, Axis members view U.S. and allied efforts to de-escalate as a sign of weakness and as license to advance their interests aggressively below the threshold of what they think might elicit a concerted response or a military response against them. And I think it's important to remember that, that just before Russia's unprovoked reinvasion of Ukraine in February of 22, the President Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping issued their joint statement in advance of the Beijing Olympics, celebrating their love for one another or their partnership with no limits, and announcing a new era of international relations. The message was, hey, we're in charge now. You across the West and democratic nations get used to it. Consider how after that statement, nations around the world imposed sanctions on Russia and deepened, and Russia deepened as a result of that its dependence on Beijing. So Russia and Beijing have come obviously even closer together, especially Beijing's ability to purchase the oil and gas necessary to feed Putin's ATM and give him the cash that he needs to continue his onslaught against Ukraine, as well as provide him, as we're learning more and more about in recent days, the hardware and equipment and components necessary to sustain Moscow's war-making machine. In addition to financial and material support, of course, Beijing diplomats and so-called wolf warriors amplify the Kremlin's propaganda and misinformation to justify, what was until recently, remember, only a special military operation, as somehow a war of NATO aggression, or a war to denazify a country led by a Russian-speaking Jewish president. But the many connections across today's conflicts extend far beyond the Moscow-Beijing cooperation on Ukraine. The Russian-Iranian and Syrian axis has enabled the serial episodes of mass homicide in the Syrian civil war, killing or displacing half of the population of that country and placing pressure on neighboring countries and on European countries. Russia has helped Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps perpetuate not only the civil war in Syria, but also sectarian civil wars across the Middle East to help keep the Arab world perpetually weak while establishing this land bridge to the Mediterranean. The Islamic Republic of Iran returned the favor by enabling Russia's onslaught against the Ukrainian people and its infrastructure, through the export of Tehran's missile and drone strike complex. And of course, not to be left out, Kim Jong-un began providing weapons and munitions to Russia immediately after the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, including, more recently, over 1 million artillery rounds. It's likely that Russia, in exchange, is helping with Tehran's and Pyongyang's missile and nuclear programs, while also providing diplomatic cover and encouragement for those actors, and especially maybe Kim Jong-un's recent intensification of threats towards South Korea and security in Northeast Asia and beyond, including the resumption of intercontinental ballistic missile testing, cruise missile testing, the tearing down of the reunification arch, and the redefinition of South Korea as the number one enemy for the North. We can talk more about what Kim Jong-un's tactics maybe are and what he's trying to achieve, if you'd like to as well. So all of that mutual support predated Hamas's mass murder attacks of October 7th, 2023, which included, of course, heinous acts of infanticide, rape, torture, and kidnapping. Iran helped Hamas, an organization that shares Tehran's professed intention to destroy Israel and kill all the Jews, build its terrorist infrastructure and capabilities, as well as plan and prepare its assault. Russian support for Hamas went beyond the Russian arms that have been uncovered in Gaza, such as Kornet missiles. Putin seemed to take October 7th as a present, for his 71st birthday. He has used the crisis to intensify his missile and drone attacks on Ukraine, launch a new propaganda campaign against the United States, and curry favor with other nations, such as South Africa and Brazil, through a pro-Palestinian stance. Pro-Palestinian after having supported the terrorist organization that diverted international assistance into weapons and infrastructure for mass murder, used the Palestinian people as human shields, and provoked a war that they knew would result in the death and displacement of the Palestinian population in Gaza. It's worth noting, I believe, that none of the tunnels underneath Gaza are available to the civilian population for shelter. The suffering of the Palestinian people is foundational to Hamas's strategy. As it called for a ceasefire in Gaza, Moscow assumed the dual roles that it has been playing alongside Iran and Syria, the roles of arsonist and fireman. Moscow, the arsonist, enables Tehran as it activates its so-called axis of resistance. That axis is really an offensive network of proxy armies and terrorist organizations from Iraq to Yemen to Syria to Lebanon to the West Bank to Gaza. Iran's cynical strategy is to expend Arab lives in pursuit of its ambitions to push the United States out of the Middle East, subjugate its Arab neighbors, and destroy Israel. Now, really, that sounds kind of Dr. Evil-esque, doesn't it? But it's true. And you just have to listen to Ayatollah Khamenei and what he says. As the arsonist, Russia helps Iran keep the Middle East in flames, Moscow, the fireman, offers to help put out the fires through mediation and moderation of Tehran's ambitions. Xi Jinping entered into a strategic partnership with Tehran, is buying more Iranian oil and providing cover to Iran diplomatically. the communist dictator in Beijing welcomed President Raisi appropriately on Valentine's Day, as Tehran was activating its proxies in the Middle East, from Iraq to Yemen to Syria to the West Bank to Lebanon, to attack Israel and US and other nations' vessels and facilities in the region. The Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, Pyongyang axis members are already working together, and it is reasonable to assume that at the very least, they will take advantage of the world's preoccupation with a crisis in one area to accelerate the accomplishment of their objectives in another. As Xi Jinping has said, the most important characteristic of the world is, in a word, chaos. But Beijing seems to have concluded that chaos redounds to its benefit and is consistent with Xi's belief that, in his words, spoken like a true Marxist-Leninist, the times and trends are on our side. Xi Jinping's call to integrate the China dream and the world dream are not just words. I recommend reading two excellent essays in the most recent Foreign Affairs, a phrase I don't often say these days, but I do, by my Hoover colleagues, Elizabeth Economy and Matt Pottinger. The CCP has published a white paper that describes how the party intends to achieve that vision of merging together the China dream and the world dream through four programs: the Belt and Road, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and, scariest of all, maybe, the Global Civilization Initiative. Xi Jinping's statements, the massive buildup of the People's Liberation Army, and acts of aggression, against Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, and India indicate that Xi is prepared to use force to achieve his dream and subsume Taiwan, follow through on his claim to the ocean in the South China Sea, and create essentially an exclusionary area of primacy across the Indo-Pacific region. Okay, all right, at this point you might be wondering, isn't this a talk about Ukraine? I think what ultimately may have convinced House Speaker Mike Johnson to clear a path for the assistance to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan was his recognition that these crises are connected and could cascade further into what was recently, I think, unimaginable, Third World War. And I'll just tell you, I guess not in confidence if we're broadcasting this, but this talk is based on a letter that I wrote to the speaker on April 2nd to make these arguments that support for Ukraine is connected to these other very consequential crises and potential crises. So at defeating Russia in Ukraine and Iran's terrorist network across the Middle East, they're important objectives on their own. They're also vital to preventing another disastrous war. The perception of Russia's success in Ukraine or Iran's in the Middle East would encourage aggression by the two other members of the Axis, Beijing and Pyongyang. Xi Jinping might conclude that, hey, it's time. It's time to lash out against what he has called the all-around containment, encirclement, and suppression against us, which sounds like an echo of Putin's claims that NATO or Ukrainian Nazis posed a threat to Russia. So supporting Ukraine's efforts to defeat the Russian invaders, reestablish security, rebuild, and develop a long-term ability to defend its sovereignty against future attacks is vital to security in the Indo-Pacific region. And supporting an outcome in the Israel-Hamas war and the broader regional conflict in the Middle East that includes the defeat of Hamas and other members of Iran's terrorist network is also important to convincing Xi Jinping that the United States and its partners possess the will and the capability to respond to aggression and support those attacked by members of the Axis. The failure to support Ukraine and Israel would encourage Xi Jinping to pursue his Marxist vision, as he put it, of seizing the historical initiative and continuing to move in the right direction revealed by history. And it would also encourage him to intensify his efforts to better integrate the China dream and the world dream. To me, those phrases echo Imperial Japan's slogan of Greater East Asia Coast Prosperity Sphere, a term rolled out the year before the attacks on Pearl Harbor and the initiation of the centripetal offensive across Southeast Asia. So if we were to prevent today's conflicts from cascading further into the Indo-Pacific region, we need to improve our strategic competence. We need to recognize the interconnected nature of these threats to international security and act together with allies and partners to restore peace and prevent today's conflicts from cascading further. Supporting Ukraine, therefore, is foundational to that overall effort, and the objective, I believe, was to help Ukraine win the war. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what that means. Of course, what we've heard recently, and consistently from the Biden administration, and I think it's positive in general, is that as long as it takes, right? As long as it takes. But what I would like to do is to hear more from the administration and others about what it is. Define it. And I believe what it is a Ukraine that is free, sovereign, independent, and capable of defending itself against further aggression, and that is whole, and is on the way to recovery. And so I think once you define that political objective, you can begin to define military objectives and gauge the degree to which the support you're providing is adequate or inadequate. Instead of debating all the time, tanks or no tanks, maybe 31 tanks. I mean, 31 tanks, really? I mean, I'm an old armor officer, and that you can solve a lot of problems with a tank, but you can solve a lot more with like 310 tanks, or long range fires, but not too long range fires. Or think about all these debates that we have. The question really is, what does it take to accomplish two military objectives? Military objective one: stop the Russians from continuing to attack the Ukrainian people and their infrastructure. That's a range of capabilities and a sufficient capacity to do that, right? That's shooting down the arrows that are coming at you with tiered and layered air defense, but it's also killing the archer, with long-range capabilities. It also includes a range of electromagnetic warfare capabilities and so forth. So I think that objective ought to be what is used to gauge that set of military capabilities, which of course crosses over to the second set of capabilities and sufficient capacity to restore Ukraine's ability to conduct offensive operations and regain control of territory. Of course, the immediate objective is to stop the ongoing Russian offensive. We could talk more about the current state of affairs. But of course, it would help tremendously, I think, to provide all the capabilities that Ukraine needs as it's trying to regenerate manpower, woman power, to man and that equipment and put it into use, and to train and prepare to conduct what is the most difficult military operation, which is the penetration of defenses, especially involving those with extensive man-made obstacles as well as natural obstacles. So those military capabilities and capacity, I think, ought to be to protect and then to enable Ukraine to regain control of its territory and resources. Of course, what else it would take to win is economic and financial support, and support for restoration of Ukrainian infrastructure. I think bilateral security guarantees could help in terms of deterring additional conflict in the future. And then I think there's a tremendous opportunity to increase the pressure and the constraints on Russia. Interdict the shadow fleet, for example, sanction Chinese banks, more pressure on Iran and the entire axis, and then support opposition groups in Georgia, Belarus, elsewhere. You've probably seen the reporting come out of Georgia in the last couple of days. But other actions are necessary to prevent conflict from cascading further and to counter other forms of aggression. I think that we have been losing on the informational battleground, so to speak, or the battleground of perception. It is, of course, for me, stomach turning, heart wrenching to see some of these pro-Palestinian protests that morph into pro-Hamas protests, anti-American protests, pro-Iran protests. I mean, I think that it probably should come as no surprise to us, for many of us who have been tracking the degree to which the curriculum of self-loathing has come to dominate our universities, and to really allow an orthodoxy to be taught in many of our humanities departments that involve, essentially the embrace of not only the new left interpretation of history, but various postmodernist and post-colonial theories, as well as various critical theories and so forth, that are essentially warp history and misrepresent the historical record, and teach our young people that their country, their interests are not worth defending. So this has been heart-wrenching to me to see it. But I think what we could do is turn the tables in many ways, just with facts and with information, to get past and over the various firewalls that protect populations that are subjected to repression from information from the outside. I think there are also ways to work with partners to create problems for Russia and other places too, Syria and West Africa, for example, like they created problems for us and others in those places. But also in doing so to advocate for for the restoration of security and advocate for the rights of those who are now subjugated to the Russian-supported authoritarian regimes that they've been able to empower. So, but there are other actions I think that are important. Not only to weakening Russia, to strengthening Ukraine in a relative sense, but to prevent the conflicts from cascading further and to counter other forms of aggression. I mentioned, the battleground of perception. I think this applies as well, obviously, to the competition with the other authoritarian regimes. Iran, in particular, which has been able to play this game for 4+ decades, in which it uses proxies to attack the United States, to attack its Arab neighbors, to attack Israel. And we act as if oftentimes we don't know what the return address is. I think it's really important for us to act like we know what the return address is. It's astonishing to me, for example, that the administration has gone to such lengths, repeatedly, to absolve Iran for responsibility for so much of what's happening across the region. And then, of course, with the competition with China, I think it's really important to clarify that China's actions and the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party, its various forms of economic aggression, as well as its physical aggression, right, in the South China Sea, ramming and sinking, Vietnamese vessels, the intimidation we see of the Philippine Navy at the moment. How about bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier, for example, the coercion against Taiwan, or the aggression oriented toward Japan, and to do so, to really make the main point that, hey, this isn't a competition between Washington and Beijing, right? This is a competition between sovereignty and servitude, and so I think much more we can do from the informational and I would say public diplomacy and diplomatic perspective to clarify the nature of these competitions and how our interests are aligned across the free world and on behalf of beleaguered populations who are living under authoritarian hostile regimes. The second thing I think we have to do is, recognize hard power really matters. I mean, it really matters, and you can be as nifty as you want with a concept like integrated deterrence, but, what didn't deter Vladimir Putin? The threat of sanctions didn't deter him. Allaying Putin's security concerns by pulling our ships out of the Black Sea didn't deter him. Suspending lethal assistance to the Ukrainian armed forces didn't deter him. Withdrawing all of our diplomats and all of our advisors and then evacuating and scuttling our embassy didn't deter him. What deters Putin is strength. What deters Xi Jinping is strength, or Iran. And I'm talking about collective strength, not just US strength, or China. What is provocative, I think, and what is common across this axis of aggressors is what provokes them is the perception of weakness. And I would just say that it is, I think, no coincidence that the world witnessed, that we witnessed, the disastrous self-defeat in Afghanistan and humiliating withdrawal in August of 2021. And that's the same month that Putin published his, so-called, his long essay, that supposedly he authored, essentially to justify what would then be the invasion, reinvasion, massive invasion of Ukraine in February of the next year. So I think it is no coincidence that the difficult relationship between President Biden and Netanyahu preceded the acts of October 7th, or the internal weakness and apparent weakness in Israel associated with the judicial reform measures and the controversy over it. Or I would say the Congress's failure until recently to sustain support for Ukraine. I think Ayatollah Khamenei was looking from Taiwan and said, hey, this might be time for me to cross this off my to-do list, this destroy Israel task, because he had doubts, I think, about how Israel could respond, and then how the United States and others would support Israel. So hard power matters. The perception of weakness is what is provocative, I believe. The third is there's a technological dimension to this competition. We have for too long allowed China in particular to engage in a sustained campaign of industrial espionage against us that has almost vitiated our differential advantage in advanced defense technologies, for example, or technologies that are important to competing in the emerging global economy. So there's a defensive sort of aspect to this, but it's really applying the tools, we could talk more about this, the tools of economic statecraft in a way that counters Chinese economic aggression without compromising the benefits of our unbridled entrepreneurialism and our free market economic system, right? I think we've learned, over time, the state is not a really good allocator of resources. So what are the ways that we can incentivize competition in the technological arena? And of course, that's related to the competitions involving energy security. Hey, it turns out, I guess, that it is a really bad idea to give a hostile authoritarian regime coercive power over your economy, right? Germany as a lesson, I think. So what can we do to learn from that? I think declaring a moratorium on permitting for LNG export facilities, I mean, how does that make any sense? From the Biden administration, from even an environmental perspective and the effort to reduce man-made carbon emissions, it makes no sense. And then, of course, this was an administration, though I think it was taking an ideological approach to energy security and climate change and the effort to reduce carbon emissions. I mean, how does it make sense to cancel a Canadian pipeline and greenlight a Russian one, which is what they did as soon as they came into office, right? Or to restrict U.S. energy exports and supplicate to the Venezuelans and the Iranians and ask them to pump more oil. I mean, so I think an integrated approach essentially to energy security, national security, and efforts to reduce man-made carbon emissions, I think is critical. And of course, that relates to the last really critical task, I think, in terms of a top priority, and that's supply chain resilience overall. Again, bad idea to give a hostile authoritarian regime coercive power over your economy. That's what China has to some degree now in critical areas, critical hardware and equipment, for example, hardware and equipment that's essential to the energy transition, for example. I'm talking about obviously, wind turbines and solar panels and the upstream components and the access to the minerals and the mineral separation and refinement processes. How about batteries, for example? So we have to do a lot more, to shift our supply chains back more in favor of resilience over efficiency. And so what else can we do? Well, how about restoring our confidence in ourselves, right? I mean, I think one of the things that's provocative to the axis of aggressors is our perception of weakness, and this is associated, I think, with real traumas that we've had in the United States. If you just think about what we've been through since a period of relative optimism in the 1990s, right? Everybody's kind of flying pretty high in the 90s, right? We had a period of sustained economic growth. We had a period of the unipolar moment, as Charles Krauthammer called it, right? We didn't have really big threats on the horizon. We had great confidence still in our technological prowess and our technological military prowess and so forth. But then we suffered a series of strategic shocks and setbacks. I mean, I think much of this is because we were kind of set up by the over-optimism of the 90s. But of course, you have 9/11, where you realize that there are still two ways to fight, asymmetrically and stupidly. We had a lot of confidence because of our lopsided victory over Saddam in the Gulf War, but he had chosen to fight us stupidly. And then also we had, after that, the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We always want to debate, should we have done it, the invasion of Iraq in particular. I think we should talk a heck of a lot more about, like, who the heck thought it would be easy and why did they think it would be easy? And in those wars, I think the short-term approach we took to long-term problems lengthened those wars and made them more costly, and I guess shook Americans' confidence. Financial crisis, 2008, 2009. Hey, toss in an opioid epidemic. And then how about the explosion of social media and social media companies that chase more and more advertising dollars by getting more and more clicks, and get those clicks by showing you more and more extreme content consistent with your predilections, and thereby drive us apart from each other and pit us against each other. Now, how about COVID? How about election denial? Hey, how about election denial in 2016? And then President Trump just taking it to the next level, in 2020 and with the January 6th assault, right? So I think what our axis of aggressors want more than anything else is to diminish our confidence in who we are as a people across the West, but particularly in the United States, and in our common identity as Americans. And they could ally with a lot of the humanities departments in our universities, obviously, who are teaching these theories that we ought to value people based on their identity category, or where they fall on a strata of oppressor and oppressed, or the strata of victimhood. These theories that make no sense to me, anyway. And so I think that what we have to do is regain our confidence in who we are as a people, regain our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. We're working on this at Hoover and across Stanford, doing some immensely important work in that area. But I do think we do have reason to be confident, even though we see kind of the divisions. And for me, again, which is heart-wrenching in terms of these students who chanting "river to the sea," and they don't know what river and what sea they're talking about. because our democracies, we appear weak, but we're actually quite resilient. What keeps me faithful are the number of people who want to come to our country. I mean, there are people trying to immigrate into China. Our most patriotic citizens, in contrast to those who are sitting in Hamilton Hall at Columbia University, are mostly immigrants. I mean, I think they're our most patriotic people because they know what the alternative looks like. Many of them, and as Wang An said, who was the founder of Wang Computers and personifies how an immigrant from China can create great wealth in our country. The founder of Wang Computers, he said that our democracy is not perfect. America is not perfect, but what we have is we have the ability to self-correct and to improve short of revolution. The contrast is our adversaries who appear strong, right? I mean, hey, the May Day parades, man, they look really good. From Russia, they can't fight worth a damn, apparently, but they look good from the outside. The same thing with China and Xi Jinping. Their appearance of strength masks real problems, real contradictions. So we have reason to be confident, I believe. And so I'll end with a Clinton quotation. And of course, by Clinton, I'm referring to George Clinton of Parliament Funkadelic, who in 1972, they came out with the America Eats Its Young album. And I think it's analogous to today, right? It was an easy period in the 1970s. Some people, even the very young-looking Norman Naymark, who just had a great birthday, which I couldn't believe because he looks so young, remembers it well. As I vaguely remember it. It was a difficult decade in the 70s, right? We had the first president resign. There's a great display going on at the Hoover Tower. If you haven't seen it yet on Watergate, it's worth taking a look at. We had lost war in Vietnam, the evacuation of Saigon, the refugee crisis associated with that. You had stagflation, a number of energy crises, and then cap off that decade with a hostage crisis, the Iranian Revolution, a hostage crisis in Iran. But we regained, I think, our confidence. And in this album, America Eats Its Young, there's a great track on that album called "If You Don't Like the Effect, Don't Produce the Cause." And in it, George Clinton writes, I'm gonna get this a little bit wrong. Ain't you deep in your semi-first class seat? You protest this and protest that and eat yourself fat. Situation is just that. It has no power over you. And what he's basically saying is, if you don't like it, right? If you don't like whatever it is, you have the power to change it. I think what we're seeing today manifests itself on some university campuses is that we have robbed young people of agency, a sense of agency. We have taught them to put the words institutional and structural in front of every problem they encounter, rather than encouraging them to make a difference and have confidence that that they can take advantage of the great promise of America, exercise their voice in a representative government, and build a better future for them and generations to come. So I think we should be confident. I think that's a big part, of us being able to counter the axis of aggressors. This is relevant, obviously, to the support for Ukraine, the support for Israel, but again, it's also relevant to preventing, these crises from cascading further into the Indo-Pacific, which would be, as we all realize, would be disastrous for all of us. So thanks, and I look forward to where you want to take the discussion. Thank you. Thanks.
I'm going to ask the first question. While you are answering, I'll look around the room and people raise their hands. I'll try to make a list. I see some questions already from the online audience appearing in Q&A, and I'll go back and forth between them. My first question, the administration has been concerned in aiding Ukraine to draw a balance between what's necessary to help Ukraine and what could potentially lead to escalation. Different people disagree about what particular weaponry you want to give that could cross that.
No.
I assume by your statement about supporting groups in Belarus that you're more willing to give some things that other people might consider offensive. And yet there has to be at some point some calculation about how far back into Russian territory can our weapons go if we give them to Ukraine. Can you walk us through militarily what the right balance is in your view, and how do you decide, given that we're on such uncertain territory right now?
Sure. Well, it's a valid concern. It's a valid debate to have. But I think actually those who think that they can manage a war like the war in Ukraine don't understand the nature of war. And And I wrote a book years ago on how and why Vietnam became an American war. And the the strategy that was adopted at the outset of the war, the Americanization of the war, I should say, was one of graduated pressure. And I'm telling you, when I hear some of the spokespeople from the Biden administration today, I think it's Robert McNamara throwing his voice, and essentially, they're talking about managing escalation, sending signals with force, and so forth. But war unleashes a psychological dynamic because it involves killing and the prospect of death that defies any kind of management. And I think what allows you to win in war is to convince your enemy that your enemy's been defeated. And if you're giving Ukraine enough assistance just so they can survive, without winning, that encourages your opponent to escalate. You're actually making escalation more likely. And I believe the party that has the greatest fear of escalation is Russia. Remember, an ex-con, ex-hot dog salesman mobilized mercenaries and marched on Moscow after taking over the equivalent of CENTCOM headquarters. And they were blowing bridges, and cratering roads on the way, right? So that doesn't seem like strength to me. It doesn't seem like strength to me that there are more political prisoners in Russia today than there were during the height of the Cold War. It doesn't seem like strength to me that there are more Russians in the internal security services than there are in their external security services. It doesn't look like strength to me that after Navalny's murder, that they're arresting people for laying flowers. So hey, I just think that if we act as if we're afraid of escalation by providing capabilities to the Ukrainians in this case, that actually we're encouraging Russia's escalation on Russia's own terms, as they've done, right? They subverted the election in Slovakia. They turned Georgia even before this, and are continuing to subvert inside of Georgia. Obviously, they're active in Moldova. They're getting ready for the Bulgarian election. They're not holding back, and so I'm not saying to put together some covert operation in Belarus. What I'm saying is support opposition movements, advocate for them, strengthen them, and to do everything you can to weaken the apparatus that Russia uses to stay in power. Stephen Cochrane, who we all know and love, is over there. Don't you love that guy? He's got it's funny, it's the best voice, So I'll do my impersonation, right? Authoritarian regime, they need five things. Five things. That's what he says, right? And so he goes through the five things that they need, right? They need cash flow, right? Which is what they need. They need cash flow. He needs cash into his ATM, right? To sustain his patronage networks, to run his war-making machine, to run a security apparatus. The second thing they need is a security apparatus, which, of course, they keep divided at times so they can pit it against each other, the GRU, the SVR, with the Wagner Group and so forth. They need control over life choices, right? Which Putin has. They need stories. They need stories to tell their people. Hey, me, I'm the only person, shirtless guy on horseback, who can save you from fill in the blank, right? The Nazis in Ukraine, or the unwashed masses of Muslims who are immigrating, or whatever the threat is, right? The Western corrupt values, you need me to protect you, right? And then finally, they need an international system that's relatively benign that allows them to continue. And so I think if I were national security advisor, not going to happen, by the way. By the way, I was fired by both presidents. I just have to tell you, right? I was fired by President Trump, and then President Biden fired me from the Board of Visitors at West Point. So just bolstering my bipartisan credentials, okay? All right, so, but if I were national security advisor, I would say, hey, let's put together a planning effort. Let's look at these five sources of strength for these authoritarian regimes, and how can we work with others, to isolate them from those sources of strength and support.
Great. I have Oriana first, and then Arzan after. And introduce yourself and who you are, your affiliation, especially for people online who can't see you.
Sure. Thank you. Oriana Schuyler-Master. I'm a center fellow here at FSI and CSAC.
I know who you are.
Nice to see you. Nice to see you.
I know. I'm just joking.
I promise I'm not going to go on some China rant. I just want to ask a very specific question, because you laid out a number of different threats. And it might just be because I just finished Joint Combined Warfighting School, in which I had to try to think as a commander and the planning efforts. But what I want to ask you is about strategic risk. Because as someone who focuses on Indo-PACOM, right now, let me be clear, I do not think the support we're giving to Ukraine or Israel detracts us from Indo-PACOM. It is not at that level. But it is true that the United States has limited resources. And strategy is about making those trade-offs. So you laid out a bunch of recommendations of the things the United States should do. Can you tell us where you are comfortable taking that strategic risk, where we're not going to be putting our efforts for now so that we can do some of the things that you laid out?
Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't agree with a lot of what Secretary Rumsfeld used to say, but he was right. You go to war with the army, the military you have. I think the resources that we have now ought to be invested in helping our two, allies who are under attack win in the active wars. Because I do, as I mentioned in the talk, I think that the prospects for war in the Indo-Pacific increase, significantly, dramatically, if Ukraine fails or if Israel, fails. So I also think, and that we're in a race and we don't know it, right? We're not moving fast enough. The Biden administration budget that was submitted to Congress, defense budget, I thought it was a joke. I thought it was like I was reading the Babylon Bee or something, or the Onion, because it is completely disconnected from the world, in terms of what we're investing in defense because of the need to address a bow wave of deferred modernization. We're seeing the emergence of a lot of capabilities that are designed to take apart what had been our traditional differential advantages, our ability to fight joint forces together, for example. We have countermeasures to allow those countermeasures, but those have not yet been fielded. And then we have big capacity issues as well in the armed forces. I think that obviously it's a bargain. If we were to spend 4% on GDP, it would be a historic, low in terms of levels of spending during the Cold War. It would allow us to address these capacity deferred modernization issues. And ultimately, it's a heck of a lot cheaper to prevent a war than it is to fight one. And I think that's what it's going to take. And we have issues with the defense industrial base. I mentioned the supply chain that affects defense, weapon and munition manufacturing and so forth. But I would like us to be Americans, not Americans. I mean, we can do this if we decide to do it, if we put the resources in it. But I think we're in a situation, similar to what Marshall described prior to World War II, when he said, "Hey, when you have the time, you don't have the money, and when you have the money, you don't have the time." Now, the good news is many of our allies, have realized this, right? So, countries like Poland and those on the front lines are investing, way beyond the 2%, Wales pledge. Germany had the Zeitwende. I mean, I don't know if they follow through on it completely, but we'll see. If they increase their investments. But Japan certainly, Japan doubled its defense budget. Will double its defense budget. And so, as you mentioned, Oriana, it is an issue, of simultaneity, because I think of the prospect for cascading crises, and because we're seeing an axis of aggressors that are working at least in concert with one another, and taking advantage of crises in one area to advance in another. But I think when we consider our allies and partners, I'm not as concerned as I would be without them, obviously.
Arzan, and then we'll hand it to Rose afterwards.
HR, thanks very much. I'm Arzan Tarapur, a research scholar at CSAC. My question is strangely very similar to Oriana's, but I have a slightly different take on it, which is that when you say that there are all these cascading crises and our job should be to deter or prevent them cascading and getting even bigger, surely part of the reason we find ourselves in this situation after the unipolar moment is not because strategic shocks happened to us. These are calamities of our own making. For 2 decades, we took our eye off the Indo-Pacific and were stuck in Southwest Asia. And it's not just a matter of dollars and bullets, it's a matter of leadership attention, right? So on this issue of prioritization, if we are strong everywhere, are we not strong nowhere? Surely there has to be a sense of prioritizing what is the bigger threats, what are the bigger threats, and where we can take risk. I'm sorry if this is sort of repetitive, but I feel like it's not just a matter of increasing the defense budget. There has to be also a sense of prioritizing.
Well, there are others making this argument. You're making the Bridge Colby argument that we should play little kids soccer and all run to the Indo-Pacific, but when this is, there might be a job for you in the America First think tank, man, actually. I'm just joking. I'm joking, man. But I think we have to recognize that this competition is global, right? That really the proclaimed pivot, out of the Middle East was an invitation to Russia to intervene in the Middle East and to take on this role of arsonist and fireman in the Middle East. Remember, it was the unenforced red line in Syria in 2013, and the invitation of the Russians to come in, and help Syria dismantle their chemical weapons that allowed Assad to get up off the ropes and continue the serial episodes of mass homicide, which are the Syrian civil war. That made Russia much more influential in the region, allowed Putin to present what I would call Putin's Potemkin peace plan, in which he says, "Hey, support a post-Civil War order that includes Assad in power in Syria, and in return, I promise, I'll diminish Iranian influence in a post-Civil War Syria," which is a lie, and of course, Assad is much more reliant on the Iranians than he is on the Russians as well. So I think the idea that we can vacate other arenas of competition, dogpile into the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait, that just creates tremendous opportunities. Look at what's happened with the Biden administration's alienation of our Gulf partners, almost a deliberate alienation of them, which has allowed China to come in ways that are unprecedented with the Emiratis and the Saudis and others. So I think, the destructive policies of the Biden administration in the Middle East, and I would say actually, it's the same people put it together. It's incredible. They screwed up the Middle East for 8 years, and they said, well, we have 4 more years to screw it up even worse, And I think China and Russia have been the main beneficiaries of that, and Iran as well. So anyway, I think they're interconnected is one argument, and then the other, is that it wasn't us that created the problem. It was Xi Jinping, man. I mean, give him credit, okay? I mean, I know that we have the tendency to think that whatever we do or choose not to do is decisive toward achieving a favorable outcome. But I think it's important to recognize that Xi Jinping has aspirations and goals that go far beyond anything in relation to us. So when we were trying to effect this big shift in policy toward China in 2017, Matt Pottinger, who's phenomenal, by the way, he was our senior director for Asia. He came in like all depressed because we're meeting resistance everywhere, man. The State Department wanted to continue cooperation and engagement, restart the dialogues, which the Biden administration has just done. And they're just going to realize, okay, they're worthless also. But anyway, a lot of resistance from industry everywhere. And I said, Matt, don't be depressed, because we have somebody on our side who's really going to help us out a lot, and that's Xi Jinping. And so I think that Xi Jinping was encouraged, by the way, by the unenforced red line in Syria. I think there's a direct line between the unenforced red line in Syria and the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, and the building and weaponization of violence in the South China Sea. I think they're completely connected, and so I also think there's a direct line between Afghanistan, as I mentioned, and the reinvasion of Ukraine as well. So it is the perception of weakness, I think, that's provocative, and I think it has less to do with maybe the calculation associated with our capacity and our capabilities, but more the assessment of our will. I think Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, I think, again, read that joint statement from just before the invasion of Ukraine. The message is, hey, you're done. We're in charge now,
Rose, and then Frank, if you pass it over there. Yeah.
This is the first Vladimir. A really simple question. It caught my attention when you said we should extend bilateral security guarantees to Ukraine, not NATO security.
Yeah.
Bilateral. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so I think this is something akin to what the UK has done, is what I was thinking, Rose. And I'd love to, will you comment on that? What do you think is feasible? What do you think would be helpful? I mean, obviously, there's risk associated with the ongoing conflict, but I'm thinking really of what Rishi Sunak announced when he visited Ukraine, 4 or 5 months ago. Would you mind sharing your thoughts on it? Because you are much more expert at this than I am.
Well, I've been supportive of these various bilateral negotiations. In the end of the day,
Yeah, right. Okay. And I support that too, Rose, absolutely, yeah.
Frank, and then Catherine.
I'm Frank Fukuyama, Senior Fellow at CDDRL. So HR, it seems to me there's an awful lot of military lessons coming out of Ukraine. And one common theme seems to be the vulnerability of a lot of big legacy platforms, both naval and ground. Could you, as a armored cavalry officer, comment on how you think war is going to be different in the future?
Right. Well, I tend to think of war and warfare in the way that Sir Michael Howard said we ought to study military history. There's a great essay I'd recommend to anybody here called "Use and Abuse of Military History," in which Michael Howard argues that you should study war in width, depth, and in context. And I think when you study war in width, you become sensitive to continuities as well as changes in the character of warfare and obviously the continuities in the nature of war. And what I see in Ukraine is different from what maybe kind of the conventional wisdom is. I don't see revolutionary capabilities. I see new sets of capabilities that are grafted onto some of the old ones, new forms of warfare that are grafted onto the old, such that conflict is evolving rather than being revolutionized. This is why it seems like future war, right? With all these first-person view drones and the transparency of the battlefield associated with satellite imagery and all sorts of collection platforms tied to long-range precision munitions and the vast drone and swarm drone capability and FPV capability. But then also, parts of that fight look like World War I, and close combat is still immensely important. And the reason that the Russian attack failed, one of the key reasons was ineffective reconnaissance capabilities and leading with your nose, which is bad in boxing and is bad in combat also. So I think that what you will see are a series of countermeasures to these emerging capabilities that will have us relearn a really important lesson in that to be successful in combat, in battle, you need combined arms capabilities and joint capabilities applied in a synergistic way. So you need tiered and layered air defense, for example, to go against this drone capability. If you want to conduct an armored offensive, you better have that air defense umbrella out in front of you. You better be able to establish a tempo of events and gain a temporal advantage such that you gain the initiative over the enemy rather than remain static. I mean, the Abrams tank was not designed to sit in a hole. It was designed to maneuver and to gain to positions of advantage and really penetrate defenses and then run roughshod over command posts and artillery pieces. That's the happy part of the attack, is once you're through, and to be able to sustain that. So that's going to require air superiority, so you need Air Force capabilities, and in this case, F-16s combined with drones, combined with long-range precision fires. It takes engineering capability. I mean, it's all, I think of battle as rock, paper, scissors, right? And so if you have a tank, that's a tank. But you could cover that tank with paper, but you need scissors then so you have to apply these all in succession with one another. If you don't have a tank, you're wearing body armor. That's an uncomfortable position to be in. You know what I mean? When you're conducting an offensive operation. So the key is to combine mobile protected firepower, which is the tank, with skilled infantry, with artillery, with obscurants, with electromagnetic warfare, with air power, and to do it in a way where you create windows of opportunity and superiority across these multiple domains, offensive cyber, and I think that's what this war shows us. It also shows us how, obviously, control of territory is what's most important at a time when everybody wants to go to missiles and standoff capabilities, and we want forces that are lean and nimble. Okay, Richard Simmons is lean and nimble, right? But you don't send him to go, to go fight anybody. You know what I mean? So, so you need to have the range of capabilities and be able to apply them in a combination to gain the initiative.
Catherine, and then we're going to take it to the other side and go to Dean next.
All right. Hi, HR. So, okay, I have a lot of comments, but I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to go through them all.
Tell me later. Tell me later.
But I'll email you.
Comment with
and your book, by the way, is fantastic on
Thank you.
on the
Thank
new
you.
the new means to gauge power. I plug it all the time I can, and I think a lot of times when people are just like counting tanks and missiles and everything, they miss all.
No, Catherine, that's not going to get her to give you a softball question.
No. I'm saying it's relevant to this discussion though, and the discussion of Russian power and
There you go. So
yeah.
that's actually how I was going to lead. Thank you. All right. So it's called Russia Resurrected. Amazon. I mean, you can get it on Amazon. It's better to get it at Oxford University Press, 2021. Anyway, yes. So I was going to say power is relative, right? And so I take your point on hard power, and that's fine. Of course, it's important, crucial. But remember, you didn't say anything about Russia having nuclear weapons other than they were going to propagate the technology. And so this does complicate how we treat Russia as an adversary, right? I would agree on the other weaknesses. This is not a long-term,
Right.
stable regime. It is one that is increasingly governed, by fear. And that's, they undervalue human life, and you have to think that someday Russians will rise up, except that's not what historically we have seen, right? So I wouldn't count on that.
No.
There's increased control of the domestic information environment, and some of these traditional values appeal to other illiberal governments. And Putin currently, because of the increased control that he has over the political system, and partly we should talk about how the sanctions may have fed into that, unfortunately, as a negative externality. They have the will to keep going. They don't think they're losing, right? He thinks 300,000 casualties, 100,000 of which are deaths, and the remainder not able to return to battle, is acceptable, and he'll keep going. And I take your point about Prigozhin, right? But that was not the military. That guy never had any military credentials. He led a militia, little one, that Putin later, acknowledged that was actually funded by the Department of Defense. And he's dead. Remember, Prigozhin's dead now. And the military is purged of supporters, right? He had an unfortunate, according to the regime, accident with a grenade in his plane that he was allegedly juggling. Anyway, so, this in many ways is still a formidable adversary, despite the fact that they have not particularly comported themselves well on the battlefield. And I think we have to bear in mind, and and this is why I'm getting to a question, I'd like to hear you comment on how realistic you think it is when Putin does rattle nuclear sabers, and he does, right? I've come to believe that I think he thinks that a limited nuclear weapon is usable. Yeah. So the last thing I wanted to say in terms of power is, I agree with much, not all, of course, of what you say about sort of self-loathing and whatnot. But let me just point out, it's not only from the left, right? It's from the right. So Moscow Marjorie, as they call her, and as she is lauded as beautiful and well-dressed in the Russian press, which I follow regularly, admires autocracy, as does her boss, Donald Trump, right? And so I worry that it is not the left that is creating the problem. It is as much the right, right? It is polarization. It is admiration for autocracy. And this will make things worse. So polarization is the weakness, not being too liberal. And I would add that your impersonation of Steve Kotkin, who I've known for 30 years, is excellent. But you forgot the one thing he always says is the one thing autocrats can't fail at is preventing opposition. And Putin has succeeded at that.
So what do you agree with and what do you disagree with about what Catherine just
exactly.
said?
I just the nuclear issue, I guess. And
All right. So yeah, I think, just first of all, on Russia and sustaining casualties and everything, I really don't know for sure, but I have in mind, kind of the French Army mutiny in 1917, right? After the Nivelle offensives, Nivelle said, "Hey, I have the solution," and he impaled the French Army on Germany's elastic defense. The French Army mutinied, right? So I think when I look at the number of casualties and I look at like the number of junior leaders they've lost and everything else, I don't know how it's sustainable. Now the question is, can they mobilize more? And they can mobilize more. Can Ukraine mobilize enough? The issue is that the Russians are replacing their casualties one for one. I don't want to say what the number is, but the Ukrainians are not replacing them one for one, right? They're taking far fewer casualties, but they're not replacing every single one of them. So it is not a foregone conclusion by any means. But wars don't really remain static, right? And as you see that now with this offensive, but with all these casualties, could this be the Nivelle offensive? I don't know. I mean, could there be, the equivalent of a mutiny? There are reports, these may be true or not, in terms of scale, of 18,000 defections out of the Russian army in the southern part of Ukraine. And so, armies can look really strong until they're just not anymore. There was a psychological turning point. So I don't know if that is going to happen. If it can happen, we'll never know until it happens. I don't think we won't know until it happens. I agree with you on the interaction between extreme left and extreme right. They feed on each other. They love each other in terms of the material that they give each other. So, these various, reified philosophies and critical theories and identity politics and the valorization of victimhood, right? This all feeds in to a right narrative, right, which resurrects old forms of bigotry and racism and so forth. And so this is how you get the destruction that you see on a college campus, right? This is also why. But I would say that the far left, if you say the far left is not a problem, I think they're a problem. I think they're a big problem. And but what's happened is I think it's threatening the U.S. military as well, because both sides of these extremes are trying to politicize the military. The military is not woke. The military is not extremist. But the extremes, on both sides are perpetuating that narrative. And guess what? That affects our recruiting, And so the military has been insulated from this, despite, I think, some political appointees in this administration who are trying to push the same kind of reified philosophies that have destroyed our campuses onto the military, which would be a disaster. And then on nuclear, quickly, and of course you have to take a nuclear threat seriously. And this is consistent, as you alluded to, with the doctrine of escalation domination by Putin. When I was National Security Advisor in 2017, 2018, I was very concerned about this. This is one of the concerns that drove the Nuclear Posture Review, which was published in early 2018, which I recommend everybody read if you're interested in these issues, because the Biden administration reversed a lot of what we did, I think unwisely. And what we did is we reinvigorated a range of nuclear capabilities that could address Russia's effort to achieve escalation domination by using a tactical nuclear weapon against maybe a European city, Ukrainian port, whatever it is, and then saying, okay, here are your choices: nuclear Armageddon, or sue for peace on our terms, right? I mean, that's really the approach that he wants to take. But I think that we have the ability to tell Putin, if you use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, it's a suicide weapon. And we don't even have to respond with nuclear capabilities to make it a suicide weapon. And then also, again, I think in Ukraine, it's not usable. I could be wrong about all this, right? So take it seriously. But I don't think a nuclear weapon is usable. I don't think the Ukrainians would stop fighting, first of all. The winds blow to the east. I mean, they remember Chernobyl. The Russian army can't fight in a non-radiological environment. How are they going to fight in a radiological environment? And by the way, I think Russia becomes North Korea on the Volga. I mean, in terms of what the international response is. So again, you're right, Catherine, to bring this up. That it is important to take it seriously. But I think that, again, as I mentioned, the party to the conflict who has the most to fear from escalation is Russia.
I'm going to ask one of the questions online before Dean, and then Herb will get the mic next. It fits in what you were just saying about concerns about the U.S. military and polarization. Your first book was about dereliction of duty. When you look at the U.S. military, when you were in the government, but sitting in the White House, which gave you a different perspective on what was going on over in the Pentagon and elsewhere, do you think that the concerns you had about military not behaving appropriately in terms of civilian advice, not pushing back, was changed when you were in power, when you were in the White House? Or looking back, with some future historian look back and say that the lessons of dereliction of duty during the Vietnam War were not as well learned as they should have been?
I think they'll look back and say that we're not as well learned as they should have been, and of course, this is the plight of a historian, right? Is that we write history so in part so we can inform the present, but then everybody ignores it. No, apparently. So I think the main point I made in dereliction of duty was that the military failed to give its best military advice for a couple of reasons. One was parochial concerns. They compromised their principles for parochial concerns. For example, the Marine Corps was promised a third Marine division if they went along with the strategy that they knew to be fundamentally flawed. But they also compromised their principles for expediency when they knew that Lyndon Johnson was unwilling to contemplate the level of force they thought was necessary to really make a difference and to bolster the South Vietnamese government and armed forces sufficiently to be able to get them to generate more significant defense capabilities of their own. What they did is they decided to go along with what they knew as a strategy that would fail, just to get the first bombing runs off, get the first troops deployed, and they were confident they could argue over time for a lifting of restrictions and more resolute military action later. And of course, what that did is it played in to the president's desire to keep Vietnam on the back burner, because he saw Vietnam principally as a danger to his domestic political priorities, getting elected in '64, passing the Great Society legislation in 65. And by going along, they prevented a discussion of the long-term costs and consequences of the strategy of graduated pressure, and it really prevented an examination of some of the implicit and fundamentally flawed assumptions that underpinned the plan. Assumptions that were actually laid bare in the Sigma 1 and Sigma 2 war games in 1965, high-level war games that we're going to do a seminar on here with Jackie Snyder, who's fantastic on wargaming, if you know, or a fellow at Hoover, one of our colleagues, examining the Sigma 1 and Sigma 2 war games.
You clearly not just read the book, you wrote the book. So, but what's the question was the metaphor for today, or the
I've
analogy
forgotten
for
most of it. I've forgotten most of it. So the metaphor today is a president can get the military advice he or she wants, basically. And so it's important for the military to understand the military's role. Your role is not to make policy, right? Nobody elects generals to make policy. Okay, if you think you should make policy, you're going to undermine the Constitution. Your job is to provide your best advice, and this is easy to say, hard to do, but not cross the line between advice and advocacy of one course of action over another. Did I agree with everything that President Trump decided during my first year as National Security Advisor? No. But hey, nobody elected me, right? And if he made a decision that he believed was in America's interest, it was our job to implement it. Now, there were some people in the administration who thought, well, I disagree with Donald Trump, you know? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to slow roll that policy, or I'm going to obstruct that policy. And of course, you know, this is a problem because nobody elected them, and they're actually undermining the Constitution if they do that. I think in any government, in any administration, there are three types of people: those who are there to serve the Constitution of the United States and to help the elected president, you know, do his or her best to advance American interests, and to do so mainly by providing best advice and multiple options. There's a second group of people who are there to advance their own narrow, particularistic agendas, you know, on trade or the border, whatever it is, right? And they don't want to give the president options. They want to manipulate his or her decisions into their policies, right? And toward their ideas. And then the third group of people think that it's their role to protect the country and the world, maybe from the president, you know. And there's a problem with those latter two groups. They don't understand their roles, right? What did Seneca say, right? This is what is most important, to understand well the role assigned to you, right? And I think some people in government don't understand their role.
I'm going to ask, I want to try to end this at 1:20 so people can get off to their other classes. So I'm going to ask Dean, Herb, and then Steve to ask questions back to back, and then give HR a chance to figure out how to respond to all three, if that's okay.
Just very quickly, General McMaster, Colonel Dean Winslow, retired
Hey,
CSAC
good to
and
see you.
School of Medicine.
During COVID, we corresponded a lot. Now it's going to feel like
Sure
a
did.
dimension. It's amazing.
Thank you again for all your help with, again, with getting Iraqi refugees over in, in years past. But anyway, so I really, your analogy of the incrementalism that we're seeing, by our, current leadership on Ukraine, really was, very much analogous, I think, to kind of what we tried with the disastrous Rolling Thunder air campaign, which I wrote my Air War College thesis on a few years after you wrote your book. The other thing, though, just real quick comment, maybe you can use this in future talks, is just the naivety of the students that are protesting, and basically, and even in wearing Hamas uniforms, which I just find is terribly offensive. I don't think they even understand that these Iranian-backed Shia militias, including Hamas, including the militias that basically in place the EFPs, explosively formed penetrator IDs, that probably were responsible for 200 of the 300 body bags that I unzipped in Iraq. They don't understand that that's what they're supporting, as well as burning women to death. Like I saved the lives of 3 or 4 Iraqi and Afghanistan women that were lit on fire, by basically the same people that, are Hamas. So anyway, just please keep up the good fight.
Well, thanks, Steve. Thanks.
Herb, and then Steve, I'm going to give you the last question.
Herb Lynn, CSAC
Herb,
and Hoover. Hi.
Good to see you.
You in your talk, you mentioned the idea of giving, in the long term, giving Ukraine the means to defend itself from Russia. I was wondering if you could sketch out just briefly what militarily that would take.
Okay. All right. So militarily, it's as everybody's heard about this. It would be long-range precision fires capabilities that are relevant to killing the archer, right? Going after the the delivery systems and the launch systems associated with long-range missiles and so forth, but also important to going after the logistics capabilities. So, for example, if the Crimean Peninsula becomes untenable for logistics resupply, the Russian army has a real hard time sustaining an offensive operation, especially in southern Ukraine. Then it's tiered and layered air defense. Now we've seen a lot about the kind of the exquisite systems we have, like the Patriot, but there are other less exquisite systems that can be used quite effectively for point defenses, using like kind of Gatling guns and ability to shoot down incoming missiles. So we could provide a lot more of those at relatively low cost, and that would be critical, maybe energy infrastructure, hospitals, and so forth, and maybe military facilities or manufacturing facilities. Then what you need is obviously the ability to restore mobility on the battlefield, and that would be a lot of the combat engineering type capabilities, armored vehicles that can deploy line charges to blow through obstacles, for example. And then I think we have the technology to do that now. You can outfit bulldozers and so forth with autonomous kits and just run them unmanned to proof lanes to get through obstacles. And then people, the old saying, that amateurs talk about tactics and experts talk about logistics. A lot of the logistics capabilities are vital, to sustaining an offensive operation. And so the adequate, resupply trucks, ammo trucks, and so forth that can sustain that effort. Then mobile protected firepower, essentially. And then, of course, what we've learned is the tremendous value of the drone capabilities and the ability to employ these in a way that allows you to attack an enemy in depth. Now, the problem is with they're losing tens of thousands of these a month on both sides of these drones because of countermeasures. Right? There's GPS denial. There's electromagnetic warfare. So anyway, it's no one thing. There's no one silver bullet. And it's a range of these capabilities. And, the Bradleys and tanks that we provided, the hodgepodge of tanks, all that kind of complicates logistics. But the Bradley fighting vehicle, I'm telling you, I mean, it ends firefights, ends them, with the chain gun, and now it's not invulnerable, so it has to be employed with infantry who clear danger areas and make sure that there's not an anti-armor ambush and so forth. So it's the combination of everything, and the Ukrainians have done a tremendously on their own with drones and maritime drones in particular. The driving back of the Black Sea Fleet, for example, sinking half of the vessels in the Black Sea Fleet. So the Ukrainians are doing quite a bit on their own for improvising. The attacks on the refineries in Russia, I think, is very smart. There are only about 15 of these really massive refineries. Domestic gas production has dropped by 50%. The price has gone up 50%. I think that was a smart move. The ambushes on trains recently that were resupplying, I think, are significant. The Kerch Strait Bridge, I think, should be dropped. I mean, I think there are ways to go after various bases that are critical to sustaining these glide bombs, which are a big threat. And then, of course, F-16s will help with that as well, especially with standoff long range missile capabilities. The LRASM missile that is rumored to be provided now with the F-16s could be quite significant also. So it's a combination.
Last question, Steve.
Thanks very much, Steve Pfeiffer, affiliate here at CSAC, retired Foreign Service Officer. One quick comment and a question. The comment is about hitting the archers. Secretary Austin on Sunday made a comment, which was sort of on the lines of, yes, we give the Ukrainians weapons, it's then up to them to choose where they target them. Some optimists like me say, did he just sort of lift that? And I'm not sure whether you have an insight on that, but hopefully that means actually that the weapons can be used against targets in Russia.
Yeah.
But my question goes to human bandwidth and what you would have seen when you were at the National Security Advisor at the highest level. I wonder how much of the failure to sort of engage on some of these other problems is simply somebody saying, my hands are so full with Russia, Ukraine. I know I should be doing more on Iran, but I just don't have the time. So I want to keep it calmer just because there's only X number of hours in the day. How much is that a problem?
Well, I think the Biden administration should try to do a lot less on Iran because everything they've done has screwed it up even worse. I mean, so what I'm talking about is kind of supplicating to the Iranians as they first came in to try to resurrect the Iran nuclear deal. Like the Iran nuclear deal was dead. Anybody see the movie Weekend with Bernie? You know, the whole movie, it's a dark comedy about trying to keep the appearance that this dead guy's alive for the whole weekend, you know, and that's like how they were with the Iran nuclear deal. And of course, going along with that was a series of concessions to the Iranians, you know, big payoffs, the relaxation of sanctions, which you know, we believe resulted in the transfer of about 80 to $100 billion to the Iranians. And then efforts to the $6 billion released from the Qataris, and everything just portrayed weakness to them. So I think there's an ability to conduct concurrent activity for the United States and our partners. I think we also created opportunities for the Iranians, you know, by the approach taken to the Emiratis and the Saudis in particular. And there was good reason, obviously, for chastising the sanction Mohammed bin Salman after the murder, you know, of a U.S. resident and journalist, Jamal Khashoggi. But you know, at some point, you have to understand, you know, or think about, you know, is Saudi Arabia on a better trajectory with our engagement or relationship, or without it? And so, I think there were a number of approaches. Not to blame the Biden administration. I mean, the party that deserves the blame is the Iranians, you know. But I do think the response to the Iranian threat has been counterproductive. You know, again, resurrecting this belief, you know, that Ayatollah Khamenei would be like the Grinch on Christmas Eve. You know, I mean, if he was welcomed back into the international order, you know, his heart would grow 2 sizes bigger, and he'd give back all the presents to Whoville. You know, it's not going to happen, I don't think.
Well, let us hope that we'll have H.R. McMaster come back in the fall to talk about his next book, At War with Ourselves, My Tour of Duty in the Trump White House. This was the first seminar that I know of that ended a talk with a George Clinton and the Funkadelics quote. And for that in itself, it was memorable, but thank you for such a provocative and interesting talk.
Thanks, everybody.